Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into the real Wild West, not the Hollywood fantasy filled with fearless cowboys and dramatic duels, but the raw, unforgiving version, where survival was never promised. You might believe you're tough enough to make it out there, but trust me, there's a reason it earned the name Wild. Before we jump in, if you enjoy these stories, a quick like or subscribe really helps, more than you know. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always amazing to see how this little community connects from all over the world. So, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're about to find out why surviving even a single day in the untamed American frontier would have been nearly impossible. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the Wild West of the 1870s. The good news? You're about to experience one of the most legendary eras of history firsthand. The bad news? Your odds of survival just dropped sharply. Your first challenge hits before you've even opened your eyes. The smell, not the fresh, earthy scent of nature you might picture, but a heavy, choking stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and possibly raw sewage lingering in the air. Hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority out here. Bathing was considered a rare luxury, maybe once a month, if you were lucky. Some settlers went through the entire winter without so much as a proper wash. Water was simply too valuable to waste on cleaning when it was needed for drinking and cooking. Dragging yourself from bed doesn't make things any better. Your mattress? Probably nothing more than a sack stuffed with straw, crawling with bed bugs. Every muscle in your body aches. Life on the frontier meant endless labor, from sunrise to sunset. No days off, no holidays, and certainly no modern comforts. Whether you were farming, mining, or working cattle, your body was the only tool you truly had, and it was pushed until it broke down. Think you work hard in today's world. Out here, back-breaking labor left even the strongest men and women crippled with arthritis before they hit their 30s. 14-hour days of plowing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or clawing through dark mine shafts weren't the exception. They were the norm. It's no surprise. The average life expectancy hovered around just 35 years. As you stand on the dusty floor, a new problem greets you: the temperature. If it's winter, the inside of your cabin could be colder than 20 degrees below freezing. With firewood scarce, you probably let your fireplace burn out overnight just to conserve fuel. And if it's summer, prepare to sweat through every layer of clothing you own. Out here, there was no escape from the elements. Speaking of clothes, forget fashion or even comfort. A man might own only 2 sets, rough canvas or denim pants, and a couple of cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women had it even worse. Multiple layers were the standard: chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged through dirt and dust. Everything was scratchy, stiff, and rarely washed. Those elegant, spotless Western outfits you see in movies. Pure fantasy for the average settler. Then comes the growl of your stomach, a reminder it's time for breakfast. Hope you're not picky, because the menu rarely changed. Beans, biscuits, and coffee, meal after meal. The frontier diet was bland and far from balanced. Fresh produce was a rare treat, only available in certain seasons. Meat, when you had it, was usually smoked or salted just to keep it from spoiling, since refrigeration wasn't an option. One of the hidden killers of frontier life was scurvy, a disease caused by lack of vitamin C. Today, we know it's easily prevented. But back then, settlers had no idea. Gums would bleed, teeth would loosen and fall out, and the illness frighteningly common. And if you're hoping for at least a good cup of coffee to start your day, prepare to be disappointed. Forget the rich aroma you're used to. On the frontier, coffee was boiled until it turned almost black, bitter enough to make you wince. Sometimes, people tossed in crushed eggshells or even a pinch of salt to cut the harsh taste. It wasn't enjoyable, but it delivered the caffeine kick you needed to push through another brutal day. So, you drank it without complaint. Before stepping outside, you'd better check your boots. Scorpions, spiders, or snakes often crawled in overnight looking for warmth. Shaking out your shoes each morning wasn't just superstition, it was survival. One careless slip, and you could be dealing with a venomous bite miles from the nearest doctor. Stepping out of your cabin, the scale of the wilderness hits you. The American frontier stretched wide and beautiful, but it was also merciless. Weather could turn deadly without warning. One day, you might face a blizzard. The next, a drought, or perhaps a sudden tornado or flash flood. Clear skies offered no guarantee. You might think moving into a frontier town would make things safer, but towns carry dangers of their own, with no sewage systems, poor sanitation, and little understanding of disease. Illnesses spread like wildfire. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis, constant threats. A single outbreak could wipe out half a settlement in just a few weeks. As you ride into town, you notice something else. There's no neat, grid-like planning. Buildings were thrown up wherever it was convenient. Streets were just dirt paths, turning into thick mud when it rained, and choking dust when it didn't. The smell was overpowering. Horses were the main mode of transport, which meant manure everywhere, often piling knee-deep in busy spots. With no sanitation crews, swarms of flies fed on the waste, making it easy for diseases to spread. Walking down the main street, you pass by the local saloon. Forget the polished image from movies, with swinging doors, shining wood, and cheerful piano music. Most saloons were rough, one-room shacks, with crude plank bars and cheap, rickety furniture. As for the alcohol, it wasn't fine whiskey, carefully aged. It was often raw, poorly distilled liquor. And to make it more potent, bartenders might mix in pepper, tobacco juice, turpentine, or even gunpowder. One bad drink could leave you blind or dead. But saloons weren't just dangerous because of the drinks. They were hotspots for violence. The Hollywood shootouts at high noon, mostly myth. Real frontier violence was rarely organized. It was messy, spontaneous, and usually fueled by alcohol. A drunken insult, a cheating accusation, or a simple misunderstanding could quickly spiral into bloodshed. In a society where almost everyone was armed, that brings us to weapons. Yes, nearly everyone carried one, but not just for duels or self-defense. Guns and knives were tools of survival. You needed them for hunting, scaring off predators, or even sending signals across the vast landscape. With bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes around every corner, traveling unarmed was asking for trouble. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns weren't the lawless free-for-alls Hollywood makes them out to be. In fact, strict gun control was common. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to hand over their firearms upon entering town. The legendary gunfight at the OK Corral, it actually began because the Clanton gang refused to follow Tombstone's gun ordinance. The truth is, those dramatic, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were practically non-existent. Most shootings were ambushes, botched robberies, or drunken brawls, chaotic, sudden, and completely lacking the sense of honor movies like to portray. Continuing your walk, you pass the local doctor's office. Medical care on the frontier in the 1870s was nothing short of terrifying. Many doctors had little to no formal education. Surgery was often performed with nothing more than whiskey or morphine for pain, and sterilization was unheard of. A simple cut could easily lead to a fatal infection or even amputation. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury, arsenic, and other poisons that frequently harmed patients more than they helped. For women, childbirth was especially dangerous, with mortality rates as high as 1 in 4. In remote regions, dentistry wasn't much better. Extractions were done with crude tools and no anesthesia, leaving most people to suffer years of pain before eventually losing their teeth. Out here, whether you survived an illness or injury often came down to luck rather than medicine. Broken bones healed crooked, infection spread unchecked, and disability was common. That old phrase, "Only the strong survive," brutally literal in the Wild West. By midday, your stomach reminds you it's time for lunch. The local restaurant is probably just someone's home, doubling as an eatery. The food, not much better than breakfast. Meat was often tough or spoiled, despite heavy salting or smoking, and any vegetables were cooked until they were soft mush. Food safety standards didn't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning were frequent dining companions. While you eat, conversations around you drift toward danger, rumors of Native American raids, outlaw gangs, and warnings about traveling alone. In reality, Native attacks were far less common than popular culture suggests. More often, it was settlers and the U.S. military who initiated violence as part of the relentless push to displace indigenous people. Still, tensions ran high, and violence sometimes flared on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat, especially in remote regions. With law enforcement stretched thin, one sheriff might cover thousands of square miles. Justice was inconsistent at best. Vigilante justice filled the gap. Lynch mobs weren't unusual. And the principle of innocent until proven guilty rarely applied. Being accused of horse theft or cattle rustling could mean a rope around your neck before sunset, regardless of whether you were guilty or not. After your meal, you stopped by the general store to stock up on supplies, only to be hit with sticker shock. Basic goods were far more expensive here than back east, thanks to transportation costs. A simple can of peaches could run the modern equivalent of $20. Many settlers poured most of their earnings into bare necessities, leaving almost nothing for comforts or luxuries. The store also reminds you of the crushing isolation of frontier life. Mail was slow and unreliable. Newspapers were often weeks or even months out of date, and news from family back home might not reach you for years. Out here, distance didn't just separate you physically. It cut you off from the wider world. For many settlers, moving west meant saying goodbye to loved ones forever. Letters traveled slowly, and countless families never reunited. The isolation weighed heavily on people, fueling high rates of depression alcoholism, and even suicide on the frontier. By late afternoon, you notice dark clouds building on the horizon. Out here, weather wasn't just unpleasant, it could be deadly. With no forecasting systems, storms struck without warning. Blizzards stranded travelers and froze them where they stood. Tornadoes wiped out whole towns, leaving survivors with no emergency services to turn to. Flash floods swept away wagons, while relentless droughts destroyed crops and brought starvation. Even if you had shelter, it offered little comfort. Frontier homes were built quickly, with whatever materials settlers had on hand. On the open plains, sod houses were common. In forested regions, log cabins, and in towns, simple wooden shacks. But none of them held up well against the extremes. Winter nights inside could be bitterly cold, with frost forming on the walls, while summers turned upper floors and attics into stifling ovens. As the storm grows closer, you hurry back toward your cabin. On the way, you pass a group of weary miners heading underground. Mining was among the most dangerous jobs of the era. Cave-ins, poisonous gas, explosions from mishandled blasting powder, heavy machinery accidents, constant threats, long-term health problems like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold extraction were just as devastating. But mining wasn't unique in its risks. Farming involved unforgiving tools with no safety features. Ranching meant wrangling animals that could crush or gore you in an instant. Logging, with its falling trees and heavy saws, had one of the highest death rates of all. No matter your trade, the odds of serious injury or death were far higher than anything we face today. You make it home just as the rain begins. The roof leaks in several places, and you set out buckets to catch the dripping water. Clean drinking water was scarce, and many settlers drew from the same sources used for washing clothes or watering animals. It's no wonder waterborne diseases spread so quickly, often with fatal results. Sitting in your damp, dimly lit cabin, you can't help but think about how different the reality is compared to the Wild West shown in films. There were no clear heroes or villains, just ordinary people trying desperately to survive in brutal conditions. The fact that anyone endured speaks volumes about human grit and determination. Night falls early, without electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide only a faint glow, and you handle them with care. Fire was one of the greatest fears in frontier towns. A single spark could consume homes, businesses, and lives with no fire department to call. Entire communities burned to the ground more than once. Exhausted, you finally crawl into bed. Your muscles ache from the endless work. Your stomach churns from the rough food, and your mind is heavy from the constant awareness that danger lurks everywhere. As sleep slowly takes over, one question lingers. Will you survive another day in the unforgiving Wild West, or become just another forgotten statistic of the frontier? The wind howls outside your cabin, a chilling reminder of just how fragile people really were against the vast, untamed wilderness. If you're fortunate enough to see tomorrow, it will bring the same relentless hardships, and likely new ones you haven't even imagined yet. In the Wild West, survival wasn't something you could count on. It had to be earned, day by day, hour by hour, through struggles most of us today can barely comprehend. Morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from another restless night. Your body protests against the hard, lumpy mattress. But there's no time to linger. The frontier waits for no one. As you rise, memories of yesterday's brutal introduction to frontier life linger in your mind, leaving you to wonder, what new challenges will today bring? Let's imagine you decide to leave town and set out across the frontier, whether your destination is another settlement, a wagon train headed west, or simply the open unknown. Travel in the 1870s was nothing like the journeys we're familiar with today. The one piece of good news. By this point, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, linking America's east and west coasts. The bad news, unless you had money to spare or were traveling between major cities, chances are you couldn't afford to ride it. For ordinary settlers, travel meant going by horse, wagon, or for many, simply on foot. Owning a horse was considered a stroke of good fortune. Horses were costly to purchase, and just as costly to maintain. A single good horse could cost months of wages. And that was before you added saddles, bridles, feed, and the constant risk of illness or injury. Veterinary care often boiled down to one harsh choice. If a horse broke its leg or grew too sick, you put it down. And riding wasn't the smooth experience you might picture. Saddles of the era were built for utility, not comfort. Even skilled riders ended the day with blisters, soreness, and stiff muscles. Worse still, a startled horse could easily throw you, leaving you with broken bones, or worse, miles from any hope of medical help. If a horse was out of reach, you might travel by wagon. Forget the picture of smiling pioneers rolling across endless prairies. In reality, wagons were brutally uncomfortable, with little more than wooden wheels and no suspension. Every rock, rut, and bump rattled through your body. The constant jostling often caused a form of motion sickness so bad it left travelers nauseous for hours. And the roads, most were nothing more than dirt trails worn down by previous travelers. Rain turned them into deep, sticky mud that swallowed wagons into the axles. In dry seasons, clouds of dust choked the air until you could hardly breathe, much less see. Wagons broke down often, wheels split, axles snapped, and repairs had to be made right there, no matter how far you were from the nearest settlement. Now, let's imagine you're joining a wagon train bound for California or Oregon. That meant taking on the famous Oregon Trail, a journey of over 2,000 miles, one of the most dangerous undertakings of the 19th century, between the 1840s and 1860s. About 400,000 people attempted it. Roughly 1 in 10 never made it. The trail earned the grim nickname, the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that for every mile of the Oregon Trail, 10 to 15 people died. Let that sink in. Every mile marked by death. Imagine riding the Oregon Trail and seeing graves every few hundred feet, roughly one every 350 feet, stretching for nearly 2,000 miles. The path west was lined with crude wooden crosses and stone markers, many without names. Families had no choice but to bury loved ones quickly before pressing forward, their grief carried silently with every step. Disease was the greatest killer of all. Cholera, spread through contaminated water, was the most feared. It struck fast, bringing violent diarrhea and vomiting that drained the body so quickly. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by nightfall. With no real treatment, entire wagon trains sometimes lost dozens of people in a single outbreak. Dysentery, typhoid, mountain fever, all tore through camps, leaving children especially vulnerable. Many families lost multiple children. before ever reaching their destination. Medical care was little more than guesswork. Folk remedies, superstition, treatments that often did more harm than good. And then there were the rivers. Pioneers had to cross countless waterways, including the Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers. Wagons weren't built to float, but settlers often tried to make them anyway, essentially turning them into makeshift boats. Accidents were common. Wagons capsized, drowning people, animals, and destroying precious supplies. Hundreds of lives were lost to rivers alone during the migration. Despite what dime novels and movies suggest, Native American attacks on wagon trains were relatively rare. More often, tribes offered assistance, trading goods, guiding travelers, or helping with dangerous crossings. The majority of violent deaths on the trail came not from conflict, but from accidents, being crushed under wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearm accidents were surprisingly common as well. Most travelers carried guns, but few knew how to handle them safely. The emotional toll of the journey was staggering. Parents buried children by the roadside and were forced to keep moving the very same day. Delays weren't an option. Every lost day reduced the chance of crossing mountain passes before winter snows closed them off. The relentless pace, coupled with grief and exhaustion, drove many travelers to mental collapse. Suicide was not unheard of among those who simply could not endure the strain. And if you did survive long enough to reach Oregon or California, your trials weren't over. Many families arrived penniless, starving, and sick, having poured every resource into the journey itself. The Promised Land often greeted them with its own harsh realities. But maybe you weren't chasing the faraway dream of the Pacific coast. Perhaps you were only traveling to the next settlement or nearby town. Even short trips carried enormous risk. Outlaws lurked along remote trails, and while stagecoach robberies were later exaggerated in fiction, they still happened often enough to keep travelers on edge. The land itself was equally dangerous. Flash floods swept away paths. Without warning, desert heat brought dehydration and deadly heat stroke. Winter storms stranded travelers and froze them in their tracks. And in the most extreme cases, like the infamous Donner Party, starvation forced survivors to unthinkable choices, even cannibalism, just to stay alive. Finding your way across the frontier wasn't as simple as following a GPS, or even a reliable map. Detailed maps were rare, and travelers often relied on vague directions, shifting landmarks, or the guidance of trail leaders whose knowledge wasn't always dependable. A single wrong turn in the wilderness could leave you stranded without supplies, a mistake that could quickly turn fatal. As you push farther west, you begin to notice something movies rarely show: the remarkable diversity of the frontier. The Wild West wasn't just white settlers and cowboys. It was a cultural crossroads where people from around the world converged. Chinese immigrants labored on railroads, mined the earth, and opened shops. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest for generations before it became part of the United States. Black cowboys made up as much as a quarter of the workforce on some ranches. Waves of European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their own traditions. And above all, dozens of Native American nations had lived on these lands for thousands of years before newcomers ever arrived. But diversity didn't mean equality. Far from it. Prejudice and violence were everyday realities. Chinese workers, for example, endured constant discrimination and were often forced into the most dangerous, lowest-paying jobs. After the Mexican-American War, Mexican landowners lost farms and ranches, sometimes through legal trickery, other times through outright theft. Black Americans who moved west, hoping for freedom from Southern racism, discovered that prejudice was alive and well on the frontier too, even if it took different forms. Despite their vital contributions to ranching, mining, and town building, they were frequently shut out of opportunities and denied social acceptance. For Native Americans, the westward expansion of settlers was catastrophic. Before European colonization, as many as 15 million indigenous people lived across North America. By 1900, that number had fallen below 300,000. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and the destruction of essential food sources like the buffalo devastated countless nations. Government policies forced tribes off their ancestral lands and onto reservations, often in barren areas with little chance of survival. When valuable resources like gold or oil were discovered on those reservations, treaties were broken again and again. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to erase their culture, under the brutal motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The popular cowboys versus Indians stories told in later films erase the reality of these interactions. Many native nations, at first, tried to adapt and coexist. Violence most often erupted only after settlers and the government broke treaties, pushed into tribal lands, or deliberately provoked conflict. And then there were the women of the frontier, another group whose lives were nothing like Hollywood's romantic portrayals. They weren't just school teachers or fragile damsels waiting to be rescued. They were pillars of survival. On farms and homesteads, women carried out traditional domestic work, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, but they also shouldered back-breaking labor in the fields, managed livestock, and defended their homes when men were away. Their days started before sunrise and rarely ended before midnight. A frontier woman might plow a field at dawn, help deliver a neighbor's baby in the afternoon, fend off wolves attacking livestock before evening, and still prepare meals, mend clothes, and care for her children late into the night. Life on the frontier was especially harsh for women. Many became widows at a young age, left to manage farms or small businesses on their own while raising children. Despite carrying such heavy responsibilities, women had very few legal protections. In most states and territories, married women couldn't vote, couldn't own property independently, and often lost custody of their children if a marriage ended. Domestic abuse was usually dismissed as a private family matter, leaving victims with little or no legal support. For unmarried women, opportunities were limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable careers available, though female teachers earned far less than men and were often expected to step down once they married. Others carved out independence by running boarding houses, working as nurses, or opening small businesses like dressmaking or millinery shops. And then there were the so-called soiled doves, the prostitutes who worked in brothels and saloons scattered across frontier towns. Later, myths romanticized these women as glamorous figures, but in truth, most entered the trade out of desperation, often after being widowed or abandoned. The reality was brutal: violence, exploitation, drug addiction, and venereal disease. were constant threats. Even those who managed to earn money found themselves shunned by society, with few chances to leave the profession and start anew. Yet, the frontier did offer some women opportunities for greater independence compared to life back east. The shortage of women in Western settlements meant they had more marriage choices and, in some cases, were treated with greater respect, as communities worked hard to attract and keep female residents. A few territories, such as Wyoming and Utah, even granted women the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing the vital role women played in building and sustaining frontier communities. And so, as the sun sets over the rugged frontier, it's clear that life in the Wild West was nothing like the romantic tales Hollywood later sold us. There were no heroes riding into the sunset, just ordinary people battling hunger, disease, violence, and the unforgiving land itself. Every day was a gamble for survival, and the odds were rarely in their favor. Yet, out of that struggle came stories of grit, determination, and resilience that still echo through history. The frontier tested the limits of human endurance, and while many perished, those who endured helped shape the foundation of modern America. So next time you watch a Western movie, remember this: the real Wild West wasn't a stage for legends. It was a battlefield of survival, where simply making it to the next sunrise was the greatest victory of all.